I'll share one story with you. My grandparents, Kun and Ruth Stratham, were involved in a war. In this war, there were a group of men desperately trying to kill my grandfather. For the sake of making it easier for me to tell the story, I'll call those men who were trying to kill my grandfather the bad men. At the time, my grandfather was farming, and the bad men would hide and wait for my grandfather in the maizelands, and they would also be waiting for him when he went to a place on his farm where they make bricks. But the problem was that every time they aimed their guns at my grandfather to shoot him, a very tall man, who was actually more than 6 feet tall, with bright white clothes, would step in the way. My grandfather didn't know about this at the time. But one day when he was about to go to the barns, he had a check in his spirit that he just mustn't go. Normally he would never allow his workers to drive his vehicles, but that day he sent a driver because he just had a strong feeling that he mustn't go. The bad men were waiting for my grandfather at the barns, and when my grandfather's driver arrived, they caught him and tied him up to interrogate him. They asked the driver, "Who is that very tall white man that stands in the way every time we want to shoot Mr. Stratham?" The driver told them, "I've got no idea what you're talking about. I've never seen any tall man in white clothes with Mr. Stratham." And the bad men were so angry that they severely beat up the driver because they thought that he was lying. So the driver told my grandfather this story, and that's how he got to know about it. After some time, the bad men were starting to get mocked in their community because the people were saying, "These are just two old people, and after all this time, you can't even kill them." So the bad men said, "Don't worry, on Saturday night, we're going to kill them." So the following Saturday night, 10 of the bad men went with their AK guns to my grandparents' house on their farm. A little while later, the farm laborers saw running in terror past the compound, and they wouldn't stop. The next day, my grandfather saw the bad men's footprints outside his fence, so he realized that they'd been there, but it was only later that he got the full story. The farm workers told my grandparents that they had seen the bad men run past their compound that night. In the beer hall the following Saturday, the people in the community asked the bad men, "What happened? We saw you running for your lives the other night, but we thought that you went to kill them." And the bad men then explained that when they got to the house, they saw hundreds and hundreds of very tall people in bright white robes in the garden, and that is what made them flee in terror. Then at a later stage, my grandparents were attacked. But on 3 separate occasions before that, 3 different people had phoned my grandparents and they had said, "We have just read the most wonderful psalm in the Bible, Psalm 91. We recommend that you read it." My grandparents have been married for 60 years now, and since the day that they got married, every single morning when they wake up and every single night before they go to bed, they read the Word and they pray together. On the evening of the 27th of November, they read the daily bread, and the scripture reference for that night was Psalm 91. Later that night at 11 o'clock, they were attacked. And this attack went on for 4 hours, and every bit of their house was shot up. My grandmother didn't even have one piece of clothing or furniture that wasn't shot to pieces. The next morning, they picked up 3,000 AK bullet casings in the house. They also fired 7 rockets and 6 hand grenades into the house, and some of those hand grenades exploded in the room that my grandparents were in. Where my grandfather was sitting, there were bullets in the wall all around his head. His head was full of dust, but not one bullet touched him or my grandmother. The whole house was shot up, but my grandparents were fine. The farm workers got the shock of their lives the next morning when they saw that my grandparents were still alive. Remember Psalm 34 verse 19, Many are the afflictions and evils that confront the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. Since then, my grandparents speak Psalm 91 over their lives almost every day, and when I was a young child, they drummed it into me. I could say Psalm 91 off by heart by the time I was about 8 years old. And when I was 16, I was hijacked at gunpoint in Harare in Zimbabwe. The hijackers were about 11 men, but I can't say for sure. And these men all had guns. Myself, my friend and her father didn't stand a chance against them in our own strength. I was in a situation where I had 2 men holding me with guns to my head as they were swearing at me and threatening me. But in the midst of this situation, I had such an overwhelming peace. And as I stood there, I said out loud, "Lord, show me that you are true to your word." And then I began to say Psalm 91. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High will remain stable and fixed under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. You see, in a danger situation, what comes out of your mouth is what you are putting into your heart every day. God delivered me through that situation just like my grandparents, without a scratch. Now there are people